The single clatter of a silver fork against fine porcelain shattered the silence like a gunshot. That small sound expanded into something deafening, filling every corner of the room with an unbearable tension. My mother, Anne, a woman who had spent her entire life curating the perfect image of our family, fixed me with a gaze that burned from across the gleaming mahogany table. When she finally spoke, every word was measured, every syllable a controlled weapon. A government consultant. That is truly the best you have managed? No husband, no career worth mentioning to decent people. For once in your life, Maya, tell us something we can actually be proud of. Every face at that table turned toward me, every pair of eyes carrying its own private verdict. I parted my lips to deliver the same hollow, evasive answer I had given 100 times before, but the words never came. Instead, a figure emerged from the shadowed doorway, moving with a quiet intensity that immediately commanded the entire room. Agent Harris wore a plain dark suit, but the urgency radiating off him was impossible to ignore. He crossed the floor without a glance at my stunned family and halted directly before me, his posture rigid with purpose. He delivered a sharp, formal salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something real and immediate. "Call sign Echo. Operation Nightfall is compromised. Hostage protocol is active. You are needed at the TOC right now." But the silence that swallowed the room in that moment, the raw, absolute shock frozen on my mother's face, that did not begin there. It began 2 weeks earlier, at what was supposed to be a joyful planning session. We had gathered to organize my parents' 40th anniversary celebration. My father, David, a retired executive who measured a person's worth in their social currency, was walking everyone through the final arrangements with characteristic pride. My brother Mark, the family's celebrated son and a mid-level vice president at a regional bank, was boasting about the venue's security arrangements as though he had personally designed Fort Knox. Having reviewed the plans they had circulated with such obvious satisfaction, I immediately identified a serious flaw, a fundamental weakness in the guest access protocol that any determined person could exploit without effort. I raised the concern quietly, keeping my tone measured and professional. My father simply laughed it off. "Maya, sweetheart, leave the planning to your brother. Mark manages multi-million-dollar portfolios. A party is well within his abilities." The familiar cold weight settled deep in my chest. It was the same feeling I carried the day Mark's promotion earned him an engraved Rolex, while my passing the Foreign Service exam was acknowledged with a polite, distracted, "Oh, how nice, dear." Mark caught our mother's eye across the table, and the two of them shared a look soaked in condescension. "It's handled, Maya," he said, his voice dripping with theatrical patience. "There's a man at the front door. We are not exactly guarding state secrets here." A faint private smile touched my lips, one they never saw and would not have understood. They looked at me and saw only the quiet one, the daughter who had somehow fallen short. What they could not see, what they never bothered to wonder about, was that the security protocol Mark had just dismissed was one I had originally designed for the United States Department of State. To truly understand what unfolded that evening, you need to understand the two entirely separate existences I had been maintaining for years. To my family, I occupied a world defined entirely by absence, by what I had failed to acquire. It was a world of bustling restaurants and crystal glasses catching candlelight, a world governed by milestones I perpetually missed. The night Mark was named Senior Vice President, my father raised his glass with shining eyes, his voice thick as he toasted his son, his heir. That single word floated above the table like a declaration, a public confirmation that the family's future was secure in Mark's familiar, dependable hands. Everyone in that room beamed. I sat at the edge of the portrait, visible but never quite seen, present but never quite counted. Later that same evening, carrying a small and foolish seed of hope, I mentioned my own recent news. I had just completed an exhaustive year-long advanced certification program at Quantico, a grueling course that eliminated the majority of those who attempted it. My mother turned to me with a warm, empty smile. "Oh, isn't that lovely, dear," she said, her attention already drifting back toward the golden child. "Another certificate for your collection." Then, without missing a beat, "Did you notice the watch we had engraved for Mark?" The watch was never just a watch. It was the down payment on the condo, the co-signed car loan, the unbroken current of encouragement that had flowed in his direction since childhood, while I received occasional tolerance dressed up as support. "Still trying to be Mighty Maya," Mark teased, and the room laughed warmly. I smiled back, a hollow expression I had spent 20 years perfecting. Then there was my other world, my real world. That world existed in silence and cold air, under the low, persistent hum of servers in a windowless, classified space officially designated a sensitive, compartmented information facility. Here I was not Maya, the disappointing daughter. I was Echo, the lead analyst on an active counterterrorism operation. In this world, the only currency was accuracy, and the consequences of failure were not missed promotions, but lives extinguished on a screen. I recall one particular night when the room had descended into chaos, two senior agents shouting competing strategies, while a rapidly deteriorating situation waited for no one. The noise was dangerous and useless. Then the door opened and Director Thorne walked in, an intelligence veteran who had recognized something in me that my own family had never cared to look for. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Enough?" and the room went still. His eyes moved across the data streams on the main display before settling on me. "What is Echo's threat assessment?" he asked. Every person in that room turned to face me. I drew a slow breath and began, my voice even and unhurried. "The SIGINT intercept places the asset squarely in the red zone," I said. "Both proposed extraction routes are already burned. I need ISR coverage on 3 specific grid coordinates immediately." We put a drone on station to run a diversionary pass, pulling their attention to the west while our primary team advances from the southeast. Lower probability of direct contact, higher probability of clean extraction. The room absorbed this in silence. The 2 senior agents studied the map, and the hostility slowly dissolved from their faces, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Director Thorne gave a single nod. "Execute Echo's plan," he said simply. "It's sound. No applause, no champagne, no watch engraved with my name. Only quiet, earned, absolute respect. That meant more to me than anything my family had ever offered or withheld. The strain of living inside both worlds simultaneously had grown nearly unbearable. My father had sensed the tension and attempted his version of a solution. He pulled me aside in the kitchen a few days after Mark's celebration, arranging his face into something resembling parental concern. "You know how your mother is," he began, as he always did when he wanted me to shrink myself for someone else's comfort. "She just worries. Mark's life is easy to describe to people. This classified work of yours sounds like you are hiding something shameful." He lowered his voice as though offering me a genuine gift. "Why not just tell her you work in human resources? It would smooth everything over for everyone." Human resources. He wanted me to compress my entire existence, the sleepless nights, the crushing weight of consequence, the lives I protected from the deepest shadows, into a tidy, digestible fiction so that he could feel comfortable at dinner parties. He did not want to understand who I was. He wanted me to perform someone easier to explain. I looked at him then, at the man who should have been my fiercest defender, and felt only a vast and quiet distance where love was supposed to live. After that conversation, something inside me stopped hurting and simply went cold. The sting of being dismissed had burned itself down to clear, hard resolve. Their ignorance was no longer merely a personal wound. It had become a genuine security liability. I thought about our distant relative, a federal judge confirmed as a guest at the anniversary party. I also thought about the low-level threat chatter my division had recently flagged in connection with him. Nothing that warranted a full protective detail through normal channels, but far more than enough to make Mark's guy at the door a catastrophic inadequacy. Arguing with my family about it would have been pointless. So I stopped trying to speak their language and fell back on the only one I trusted completely. That night, I opened my encrypted terminal. not as Maya, the frustrated daughter, but as Echo, the senior analyst eliminating a risk. I drafted a formal situational awareness brief with methodical precision, citing the specific threat indicators, the venue, the protected individual scheduled to attend, and the dangerously insufficient security measures in place. I routed it to the U.S. Marshals Service, knowing precisely which internal mechanisms it would set in motion. Within hours, the brief had been escalated to a hostage rescue and protective operations unit, and the agent assigned to run the discrete detail was one I recognized and trusted: Agent Harris. I sent him a single encrypted message through official channels. Reference event at 2100 Oak Lane, it read, "My presence is as covert civilian. Do not acknowledge me unless a Tier 1 contingency is declared. Your contact trigger is codeword Nightfall." I pressed send and watched the trap close quietly behind my family, who were at that same moment preparing their speeches for my humiliation. They believed they were gathering in their home, under their rules, on their terms. In reality, they were assembling inside my operational theater, and every protocol was already active. The dining room that evening was suffocating. The 40th anniversary dinner felt less like a celebration and more like a sentencing hearing. Extended family lined the table on both sides, their eyes sliding between me and my mother with the practiced anticipation of spectators who already knew the outcome. Mark leaned back in his chair with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He thought this was the night they would finally make me confess to the failure they had collectively decided my life represented. From the corner of my eye, I could see Agent Harris positioned near the entrance, invisible to everyone else, a ghost of my real life haunting the margins of this theater. My mother lifted her glass and tapped it once, drawing to herself attention she already completely controlled. She arranged her expression into one of loving anguish, a look far more frightening than any anger she might have shown. "Maya," she began softly, "we all love you, that goes without saying, but we are frightened for you." I felt my spine stiffen. I had heard this speech reconstructed from the same bones a dozen times before. It was the speech about my unconventional thesis, about my rejection of the corporate job my father arranged, about my failure to produce a suitable partner. It always arrived, wrapped in concern, and ended in an ultimatum. This vague and secretive life you are leading is not normal, and it is not acceptable. It is time you showed this family some honesty. It is time you explained yourself. She leaned forward, and her voice dropped for the final blow. "We are waiting, Maya." As the words settled over the table, a faint thread of static cut beneath them, almost inaudible. But I heard it. Harris's comm unit. I watched his posture shift by a fraction, barely visible to anyone not trained to read it. A real priority alert had come through, connected to a separate and escalating situation. He knew his trigger word, his eyes found mine, and the question inside them was completely clear. I could absorb the humiliation and give them another evasion, or I could let 2 decades of carefully maintained fiction dissolve in a single moment. I gave him a nod so small it was almost nothing. The fork struck the plate. My mother, reading my silence as defiance, drove her palm flat against the table. "Explain yourself, Maya," she demanded, her voice splitting with fury. And then Harris moved. He crossed the room in a few purposeful strides, his entire bearing transformed from background fixture to operational agent. He passed my father without a glance, ignored my mother entirely, and came to a halt precisely at my side. His salute was sharp and utterly incongruous with the floral centerpiece beside us, a gesture from a world of real consequence delivered into a room full of manufactured ones. His voice was steady and immediate. "Ma'am, call sign Echo. Operation Nightfall is compromised. Hostage protocol is active. You are needed at the TOC immediately." The words simply existed there for a moment, suspended above the dinner table. Hostage protocol, call sign Echo. They were the vocabulary of a world where mistakes cost lives, and they had absolutely no business sitting next to my mother's anniversary candles. I watched 20 years of their carefully maintained story about who I was collapse in under 10 seconds. My father's face went the color of ash. Mark's expression of smug victory dissolved into something slack and uncomprehending, the look of a person whose framework for reality has just been quietly dismantled. And my mother simply stared, her mouth open, the attack she had been building toward dying unfinished on her lips as the world she understood cracked cleanly apart. I rose from my chair with quiet precision and looked at Harris. My voice was level and completely unhurried, carrying nothing of the person I had been 60 seconds earlier. "Status on the primary asset," I said. "Secure, ma'am," he replied. "Secondary team is pinned down." I nodded once. "Brief me in the vehicle." Then I walked toward the door without looking back, leaving them motionless in the wreckage of the narrative they had written for me. My mother had demanded I explain myself. 3 words from Agent Harris had explained everything she had never bothered to learn. The car door closed, and the world behind it sealed shut, like a vault. The room full of centerpieces and wounded dignity vanished, replaced by the familiar, grounding focus of something that actually mattered. Harris was already briefing me before the engine turned over, his voice a clean stream of tactical information. My mind switched over with the ease of a mechanism that had been built for exactly this. The hours that followed belonged entirely to Echo. Somewhere behind me, my family was attempting to reassemble the pieces of an evening that had shattered beyond recovery. The federal judge, a man who understood discretion, had quietly excused himself before anything further unraveled. The remaining guests drifted out in bewildered clusters until my parents and brother sat alone inside a large and silent house, surrounded by food no one had touched and a truth that could no longer be managed. But all of that was already behind me, faint and fading, a transmission from another life. That night, 3 people came home because of decisions I made. That was the only accounting that mattered to me now. 6 months passed in complete silence from my family, and inside that silence, I thrived. The turning point came on a cool autumn afternoon at Langley. I stood on a small stage inside a formal auditorium while Director Thorne addressed the assembled room. He spoke about Operation Nightfall, about the leadership required to hold steady under that kind of pressure, and about the intelligence that had prevented what could have become a genuine catastrophe. Then he stepped forward and pinned the intelligence star to my jacket. The weight of it against my chest was both physical and something much larger. The applause that followed was nothing like the loud, performative clapping of family gatherings. It was the quiet, genuine recognition of people who had been in the same dark rooms, who had carried the same weight, who understood exactly what the work had required. Agent Harris was there. My team was there. These were the people who knew me without needing it explained. They were my real family now, built not from shared blood, but from shared purpose and mutual trust. The new life that followed took shape with a kind of clean momentum I had never felt before. A promotion to section chief, a counterintelligence task force to lead, an office with my name beside the door, and a window that looked out over the city I had spent years protecting without credit. My days were filled with problems worth solving, surrounded by people who listened when I spoke not out of obligation, but because the analysis was sound. This world, once my secret refuge from everything else, was now simply home. It was a world governed by merit, where your value was measured by what you actually did, rather than by how easily you could be described to strangers at a golf course. There was a clarity to it, a clean and honest simplicity that I had been starving for without fully knowing it. On an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, an email appeared at the top of my inbox. The sender was my father. The subject line contained only my name. I looked at it for a long moment without moving. A distant, faint echo of old pain surfaced briefly, the way a scar will occasionally remind you of the injury that made it. But it was thin and far away. I opened it. "We were wrong," it read. "About everything. Your mother and I understand that we have no right to ask for forgiveness. We only hope that wherever you are safe." I read the words carefully and felt nothing I had expected to feel. No triumph, no grief, no release, no bitterness. It was like receiving a letter addressed to someone who had moved away years ago and left no forwarding address. He was writing to Mighty Maya, the girl who had only ever wanted them to see her. But that girl was gone. Echo had taken her place entirely. My sense of peace was no longer fragile, no longer borrowed from their opinion of me. I had built it myself, one mission at a time, one life brought safely home at a time. I looked at the message a final moment, then moved my cursor. I did not delete it. I archived it, acknowledged, but released. My eyes moved from the screen to the tactical map already open on my desk, and my focus shifted forward to the next problem, the next mission, the next thing that was real. My past was a closed file. My future was already in motion. My whole life, they asked me to become someone they could be proud of. In the end, I had to stop waiting for their permission and become someone I could be proud of myself.